Hello class! Welcome to our channel. This is Alan Shane at your service. Thank you so much class for choosing Alan Shane's tutorial for you to be able to know more about accounting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Our discussion for today is all about what? Typical account titles used for the statement of financial position. So this is the part 1 of the video in the typical account titles used in the statement of financial position, and let's discuss about assets. So when we say assets, what does it mean? Assets should be classified into two. So we have two classifications of assets. What are those? We have current assets and also we have non-current assets. So always remember that one class, how we have two classification of assets, the current assets and the non-current assets. So per revised Philippine Accounting Standards, PAS number 1, an entity shall classify assets as current when. So, kailan natin makaklasify or masasabi na ang assets is considered a current asset? Okay. So, an entity shall classify assets as current when, number 1, it expects to realize the assets or intends to sell or consume it in a normal operating cycle. So when that asset will realize or will use or it intends to sell or consume it within the normal operating cycle, that is considered a current asset. Number 2, and if it holds the primarily for the purposes of trading. Third is it expects to realize the asset within 12 months only. So if that assets will realize for more than 12 months, so it is not considered as current. It is only considered as current when it expects to realize the asset within 12 months after the reporting period. Or we can classify asset as current when the asset is cash or cash equivalent as defined in PAS number 7. Unless the asset is restricted from being exchanged or used to settle a liability for at least 12 months after the reporting period. So when that asset is cash or cash equivalent, unless it is restricted from being exchanged, so it is considered as a current asset. So what are the account titles used under the current assets? So what are those account titles? So here, diba, we already defined what is current asset or what are current assets. So now, let's identify first what are the typical account titles included in the current assets. So first, cash. So when we say cash, it is any medium of exchange that a bank will accept for deposit at face value. So you already know what is cash. It is a medium of exchange. So this cash can also include coins. So coins, currency, money orders, bank deposits, and etc. So these are considered as cash. So It includes coins, currency, money orders, bank deposit, and etc. Next, we have to tackle about cash equivalents. So when we say cash equivalents, these are short-term, highly liquid investments that are readily convertible to cash. Therefore, those assets that are readily convertible to cash and has an insignificant risk of changes in value, that is considered as cash equivalents. Gets? So those assets that have a short-term, highly liquid investments and those readily convertible into cash without or with only insignificant risk of changes in value, that is considered cash equivalent. So next, under current asset is the notes receivable. When we say notes receivable, it is a note receivable, a written pledge. So a written pledge that the customer will pay the business a fixed amount or of money on a certain date. So, ibig sabihin, itong notes receivable, ito yung gi-pledge ng customer na babayaran sa atin or babayaran sa business in a fixed amount of money in a certain date. Meron tayong matatanggap dito. So, notes receivable and that customer has a written pledge. For that, the customer will pay to the business a fixed amount of money on a certain date. Now, let's discuss about accounts receivable. So this accounts receivable refers to claims against customer arising from sales of services or goods on credit. This type of receivable offers less security than a promissory note. So, itong accounts receivable, if ever the customer is bumili sa business ng goods or services, pero inutang, yung utang niya na babayaran sa business is tinatawag na accounts receivable, yung kokolektahin ng business sa customer na umutang ng services or goods. So, that is called accounts receivable. Ang difference ng accounts receivable at notes receivable, this accounts receivable offers less security. Less security than what? Than the promissory note or the notes receivable, because in this notes receivable, the customer has a written pledge to pay to the business at a certain amount and on a certain date. Okay, nagets? Okay, so let's proceed. Next, we have these inventories. When we say inventories, according to pass number 2, so these are assets which are what? Held for sale. So, in the ordinary course of business, in the process of production for such sale, or in the form of materials or suppliers, to be consumed in the production process or in the rendering of services. So when we say inventory, it is considered as the assets held for sale. Yung mga assets na ibibenta, those are considered inventories. Okay, next, we have this prepaid expenses. So, when we say prepaid expenses, these are expenses paid for by the business in advance. Ibig sabihin, binayaran natin ang expenses in advance. For example, if ever that you have to pay rent, for example, January ngayon, pero binayaran mo na yung pang February na expense mo for rent. So, ang tawag doon, if i-record natin siya on January, it is prepaid rent. It's because you pay the expenses in advance. So, yun ha, when we say prepaid rent. So, this include insurance and rent. It is an asset because the business avoids having to pay cash in the future for a specific expense. So, these prepaid items represent what? Future economic benefits. Until the time they start to contribute to the earning process, then it become expenses. So, that is the prepaid expenses. Okay, so understood. So that is considered prepaid expenses, expenses paid for by the business in advance. So now let's proceed to non-current assets. So when we say non-current assets, so these are longer ang life ng asset nito, more than 12 months or 1 year. So, what are the examples? So, property, plant, and equipment, or the PPE. When we say property, plant, and equipment, or PPE, these are tangible assets that are held by an enterprise for use in the production of supply of goods or services, pwede din for rental and for administrative purposes. So those are tangible assets. Then these are expected to be used during more than one period. So, pwede 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. So, it depends upon the property, plant, and equipment. So, expected to be used more than one period. Okay, so examples of those property, plant, and equipment are land. Examples: land, building, machinery and equipment, furnitures and fixtures. So these are an example of PPE, furnitures and fixtures. What else? Motor, vehicles, and etc. Okay? So, next, let's proceed to accumulated depreciation. So, when we say accumulated depreciation, it is a contra asset account. So, the balance in this account is deducted from the cost of the related asset, equipment, or buildings to obtain book value. So, diba, it's because those property, plant, and equipment will also depreciate its value. That is why we have this accumulated depreciation because it is a contra asset account. And it contains the sum of the periodic depreciation charges. So, it contains the sum of the periodic depreciation charges. Okay, so that's it for the accumulated depreciation. Now, let's discuss about intangible assets. So, intangible assets, these are, remember this one na, identifiable non-monetary assets without physical substance. If the PPE is tangible, here it is intangible. Another set is intangible assets without physical substance used in the production, rental, or administrative purposes. So, what are the examples of this intangible assets? Examples of this are what? Goodwill, patents, copyrights, licenses, and etc. So that are the intangible assets. So let's summarize again. So we have the typical account titles used under the statement of financial position. And when we say assets, we have two classifications, the current assets and the non-current assets. When we say that asset is current when it expects to realize the asset or intends to sell or consume it in its normal operating cycle. And it is also held primarily for what? For the purpose of trading. And also, current assets expects to realize the asset within 12 months after the reporting period, or the asset is what? Cash or cash equivalent unless the asset is restricted from being exchanged. Okay, so what are the account titles under the current assets? So here first we have cash. So this cash is any medium of exchange, and examples of this are coins, currency, money orders, bank deposit, etc. So we have also this cash equivalents, and when we say cash equivalents, these are short-term, highly liquid investments that are what? Readily convertible to cash, which are subject to insignificant risk of changes in value. So, notes receivable, these are a written pledge na nag-pledge yung customer na magbabayad siya sa kanyang utang at a certain date. Here in the accounts receivable, it is claims against customers also, but the difference to the notes receivable, si accounts receivable has a less security kasi this less security siya sa notes receivable because walang written pledge ang accounts receivable. Si notes meron. Okay, next we have inventories, and inventories, those are assets held for sale or mga assets na ipagbibili. Those prepaid expenses, these are expenses paid by the business in advance or the advance payment of the expenses. Includes insurance and rent. So, pwede yun. Next, we have non-current assets. So, mas longer ang life ng non-current assets, and these examples of this are property, plant, and equipment, and intangible assets. This property, plant, and equipment, this is tangible assets and expected to be used what? More than one period. What are the examples? Land, building, machinery and equipment, furniture and fixtures, motor vehicles. And the contra asset account of this PPE is called accumulated depreciation because, diba, those PPE will depreciate its value as the time goes by kasi nagamit na natin ang PPE. Kaya, the value of those PPE will be depreciated. And the accumulated depreciation or those sum of the periodic depreciation charges is called accumulated depreciation. So, ililess natin ito sa value ng PPE. And next, the intangible assets and identifiable non-monetary without physical substance. Examples, goodwill, patents, copyrights, and licenses. So, that's it for our discussion for the part 1 in the account titles used under the statement of financial position. So, abang-abang tayo sa ating part 2 and we will discuss the liabilities and owner's equity sa ating part 2. Okay, thank you so much class for listening. God bless.